really at the core what we do, always looking from the customer's perspective, how we can help them, to protect their interest. And that is not just by developing services around that, but also making sure that we hire the best people in the industry who have a passion for this particular industry that we are living in. So when we start looking at the EPI in terms of what services we would like to bring to the market, we always thought about one key thing, say, what is a data center and what is its purpose? And ultimately, when we talk about all the technicalities of what a data center is, one key thing that we always came back with, and that is that data centers are basically there, built on trust. You as a customer, whether it's an internal customer or an external customer, it's all about trusting the data center facility that it can run your business 24/7. So in our belief, there are basically three things that you need to do in order to get that right. We call them the 3 Ps. And the first one is obviously the product. This is the data center facility, including obviously all its components. The processes, because data centers need to be run very, very well with stringent processes. And of course, in order to execute those processes, you need to have qualified and competent staff that know what to do and are dedicated to the job at hand. So within EPI, basically, those are the 3 areas that we focus on whenever we are developing services. In the facility space, on the product side, we help customers with their design and the facilities itself in terms of assessments and the certification. Operations, we help customers on runbooks as well as the assessment of their operations in terms of efficiency and efficacy. And a lot of you probably know us as well from training, where we do certification for staff. So those are the 3, main pillars within our organization, supporting the idea of protecting your interest. I think well respected in the industry, working with various industry segments as well as organizations, and we have been, very blessed with various, awards and recognitions throughout the industry in various parts of the world. And that has led to a large customer base where we have provided, any type of service, whether it's training, whether it's auditing, certification, etc., crossing all the continents. Covering large organizations, small organizations, very critical organizations, not so critical organizations. So it's a widespread across, various verticals. So let's have a look at the topic of today. Let's go back and ask ourselves the importance of standards, because that's obviously at the heart of it. And not surprising, we all know that data centers are very complex. Many elements are making up a data center infrastructure. Talk about electrical, mechanical systems, networking, the fire safety, etc. And this is becoming more and more complex. In the old days, when we talked about data centers, we talked about a couple of 100 kilowatt, maybe a megawatt. Then it turned into 100 megawatts, and people were really impressed with that one. But now, if you talk about 200, 300, 400 megawatt, it almost becomes the norm, especially in the large scale operators. And obviously, as buildings are getting bigger, as power is increasing, so does the complexity, not only from a design and build perspective, but also from areas like the supply chain and overall management. And with the advent of many new technologies that are, hitting us more rapidly, by the day, this becomes very complex. We're getting quite a lot of inquiries from consultants and designers that say, please predict the future. What is the future on liquid cooling? Which way is it going? Is it immersion? Is it cold plate? Is it spray, etc.? So it shows that the industry is really going through quite a bit of motion at the moment, trying to figure out, what is going to happen. And as you all know, the issue that we have in our data center industry is always that we have to build something that is going to last for many, many years. And predicting the future becomes harder, not only on the equipment side, but also on technology side in terms of microprocessors that are going up in power, new chip designs that are coming in that might reduce it again. So a lot of complexity and confusion all along. And unfortunately, we still get hit by stories of data centers that are going down. And that could be because of operational processes. That is a large contributor. But there is also a lot of it attributed to the initial phases, the baseline that people take for the design and build, complexities in the design that are overlooked. So, or outages in the data center are not always coming out of the operational part, but it could also stemming from as early as in the design phase, where critical mistakes are sometimes made, and they could potentially only show up many, many years after. So basically what the industry always does is coming up with standards to set a proper baseline for quality. And as you can see here, with just a handful of standards that you see on the screen here in blue, we have plenty of standards in the data center, whether it's covering fire protection or electrical systems, etc. But it's quite cumbersome, of course, to go through all it. So what some organizations have done is trying to take some of those elements and put them in a nice book, where you can basically have a proper guidance on how to design and build your data centers. And some of the more common names are the ones that you find here in red on your screen. Now, before we start delving a bit into standards, we need to understand really what standards are all about. There is unfortunately a lot of confusion of what is now actually a real standard. Yeah. If you look at, say, from a standards development point of view, there are basically three things that we normally consider when we talk about standards. We have what we call de facto standards. Those are not written documents really, but they kind of like, becoming a standard by itself. For example, look at your keyboard, the QWERTY keyboard that everybody's familiar with. There is no ISO document that tells you how the keyboard should look like, but it's just something that all the manufacturers do. So that is a good example of, for example, the de facto standards. Then we have the formal standards. So they are, written by organizations with the aim to guide either an industry or particular segments. And then we have what we call de jure. Those are standards that are what we call, compulsory standards. Normally have the codes, local regulations, etc. So if you have a code in your country regulating things around fire suppression or electrical system, that falls under what we call de jure. The formal standards could be voluntary, or they could be non-voluntary. And of course, de facto is always voluntary. So who are writing those standards? Well, that is normally done by what we call an SDO, a Standards Development Organization. It's a group of people that come together and they are developing the standard, and normally they will maintain the standard through its life cycle as well. And then SDO is, having oversight by an external party, which we call the accreditation organization. So they will basically place oversight over the SDO to make sure that everything goes in the right way. And we'll talk about some of the elements there later. So in terms of the development process for a standard, it normally starts with an initial idea. Somebody says, we have a problem in the industry and we would like to do something about it to ensure that quality is part of this particular element. So normally what happens then, we have a project that is going to be defined, and then we start putting a committee together, which is normally called a technical committee. And that is where we have subject matter experts that are providing input in the document in terms of what they believe is the right benchmark setting. Once that has been developed and the committee feels that it's ready to go to market, then it normally goes through what we call an industry ballot process, where the public, so to speak, other subject matters experts, users, etc., can review the document and again provide their insights on what they believe is right and wrong and what they would like to potentially change. And after that, when that is all going through a couple of phases, then we go to what we call the final default ballot, and then the standard finally will see the light. It will be going into the world, so to speak, and people can leverage off it. So that's quite a bit of a process, and that is where accreditation really comes in. So the accreditation body will ensure that the SDO has a proper development cycle, that is a proper process in place that is being maintained. Of course, there needs to be openness, and it also creates the requirements for balance. So you cannot have, for example, only vendors in a committee. It needs to be a proper balance between, for example, users of the standard, subject matter experts, which could be, say the universities or people in the industry, etc., and the customers that use it on a daily basis. Of course, wide consideration for various views and objections that might happen, especially during the ballot process that could be in the technical committee or in the industry committee. And of course, finally, we have to come to a consensus. That doesn't mean that everybody has to agree, but the accreditation body will normally set a minimum level of where people need to vote in favor of the standard and at least have no objections. And there is also a process that is there for appeals in case there are considerations that need to be taken into account. So what happens when the document is finally released? Then there is another important party, which is what we call the scheme owner. Now, in fairness, 99% of the cases, the scheme owner is actually also the SDO that has put the document together. Why? Because the scheme owner will ultimately lay down the law in terms of who are able to do audits for this particular document, what is the process, what are the competences required of those that are actually executing the audits, and it goes down to the point of how does a certificate needs to look like in terms of elements, etc. So very often the SDO who has developed obviously the standard and know what the intent is, they also will lay down these particular rules. So then, of course, we need to make sure that those organizations that ultimately going to check whether standards are well implemented, they are again overseen by an external party called, again, an accreditation body. So we have two accreditation bodies. One that is overseeing what we call the SDO. And then there is another accreditation body, which basically takes the scheme owner's guidance and makes sure that they check whoever is doing the audits are following those rules. So who are doing the execution? The actual assessments, that is what we typically call a certification body. They could be going by different names like a registered certification body, conformity assessment body, accredited certification body. There are many names for the same party, so to speak. So this is the whole scheme of things. The SDO develops it, creates a scheme. Accreditation bodies will have oversight over ultimately the registered certification bodies who are the ones that will do the final auditing. So that is the structure, and I think that's important for you to understand how that all works when you are facing standards that you're trying to implement. So let's go a bit into more detail of the topic of today, the uptime versus TIA certification. As Dean said during the introduction, we get often so many questions about this particular topic because there is quite a bit of confusion. So hopefully the next few slides, create a little bit more clarity in what those, differences are. So we've broken it down in a few areas. The first area is the topic of the organization. Uptime and TA, both are organization originating out of the US, where also the headquarters is. Both are already in the business for a lot of years. So that is all very good news. But there is some difference between the organization. Uptime is a commercial organization. Nothing wrong with that one, of course. And TIA is non-profit, which most of the time when you have a standards development organization, they are non-profit. There is a big difference, though, in that the TIA organization is a proper standards development organization in the sense that they have external oversight through an accredited body, and that is for the TIA organization, ANSI. For Uptime, the guidelines that they develop are done in-house with committees as well, but there is not the formal process like ANSI places on standards development organizations. Then we have a look at the document. Obviously, both organizations make known to the market what they require for data centers to be compliant to the guideline or the standard. Uptime, basically the release was done in 2018 for the latest document. TIA has recently developed a new version, which is the 942-C, which was released last year. For Uptime, the philosophy is that they will change it as and when market requires that, whereas TIA, because of this accreditation, they are forced to basically review the standard within a 3 to 7 year cycle. That doesn't mean it has to change. So within the ANSI accreditation, it basically says that you need to do the review and then determine whether the standard is still relevant, whether you want to change it, or maybe you just maintain it as is. In terms of the guidance, as you can see, there's quite a bit of difference between the guidance that the two organizations are giving designers and builders. Guideline from Uptime, a couple of pages. providing high-level descriptions in terms of what they believe would be a proper design and build philosophy, whereas in TIA goes into much more detail, giving a bit more prescriptive, a description in terms of what you would need to do to design and build as per what they believe is the right data center. That also means that, obviously, since it is a proper standard for TIA, all the audit criteria will be in the document. Whereas in Uptime, it's not always 100% clear what some of the underlying criteria might need to be. So you would obviously have to consult with Uptime to get, your guidance there to make sure that you do the right thing. For TIA, it's basically all down into the document, which is actually quite helpful because you know what you need to do. But it also helps you during, for example, assessments. So if you are, not, in agreement with the assessor, with the auditor, you can of course challenge this and say, show me the clause that actually says that this is either compliant or non-compliant, etc. So it gives a bit more transparency and a bit more power to the end user, so to speak, to argue their case in, if there's some disagreement of some sort. Conformity levels, both Uptime as well as TA are separating the data center in 4 categories. Under Uptime, it's called Tier 1, 2, 3, 4, and under TA, it's called rated or rating. Both of them are outcome-based, and we'll talk a little bit about what those expected outcomes are later. So if you talk about, say, guideline or standard, as we said, a standard has been developed by an SDO, which is under accreditation. Uptime, unfortunately, doesn't have that type of setup. So we call that in the ISO type of world, we would call that more a guideline. But of course, the adoption is global. Both Uptime as well as TA are applied across data centers on a global scale. What quite a few customers that we speak to are not always aware of is actually the scope. So if you look at, say, the tier topology that is indicated in the guideline of Uptime, it basically addresses the electrical and mechanical systems, obviously being the heart of the data center, so very critical. But TA, apart from those critical systems, also take into account a lot of other elements like telecommunications, where is your site and what is the risk there, things around the architecture, fire safety, physical security, etc. So in that sense, the scope is actually much wider, addressing multiple elements that are typically making up the risk factors of data centers. In terms of the audits, so once you have maybe decided that you would like to get a formal certification, again, quite a bit of difference there. From an auditing point of view, Uptime has the sole right to audit data centers based on their guideline. For TIA, you have some more choice. Of course, in terms of the execution of the audits, normally under ISO, a certification body needs to be accredited as well. As I've explained before, that is normally done under the ISO 17021 standard. Uptime does not have that particular accreditation. For TIA, it depends. Some of the audit organizations, like for example EPI, we are an accredited certification body under the ISO standard. Some other organizations that are doing audits are not. In terms of the audit process, obviously proprietary to Uptime, they have their own methodology on how they would do the validation of their guidelines, where for TA, it's basically following the traditional ISO standard cycle. In terms of the certifications, the main certifications that both organizations are supporting are design certifications and constructed facility certification. For Uptime, the life cycle for the design is 2 years. So obviously, if you have not completed the design, you have to go back. For TA, it's 1 year, but of course, both have the ability to be extended. So if you're still under the design elements phase, then both Uptime and TA, you could go back and say, hey, can I extend my design certificate? Facility is quite a bit of a difference, because under Uptime, the certificate is for life, although there is a footnote there that Uptime, of course, would like you to report any potential changes that could have an impact on the rating, or the tier levels, as they call it, could impact. For TA, actually, they don't go by that self-reporting type of scenario. So they go and follow the ISO procedures. So you would normally have your certification, then you have 2 years a surveillance cycle, and then in the third year you have a recertification. That is, good and bad. Maybe you could argue, say, hey, I need to go through continuous certification cycles, but you're probably used to it already when you do ISO. But of course, this will ensure that the data center under scope is always living up to the cert that is on the wall. Yeah, if you have a certificate that was printed 10 years ago, of course, you have to ask yourself the question whether that is still a proper reflection of what is there today. And as we know, especially with all the technology changes, that is, of course, very questionable at the moment. Change of auditors, obviously, because Uptime, has the sole right to do their assessments. There is not really a change there that you could do. For TIA, you have some more flexibility. But the key message, TIA is the only accredited data center certification scheme that is available at this moment on a global scale. Now, the scope, as I said, very, very wide with TIA, covering basically all the elements of a mission critical data center. And again, that is why a lot of data center designers actually choose TIA as the basis of their design. And in some of the cases, we see actually that governments in certain countries also say that if you want to house government data, then it has to be based on TIA. So they clearly, obviously, understand that all the elements are important. So in TIA, they do recognize that different data centers have different criteria, in terms of business availability. So they are separating it in 4 ratings, and that is obviously similar with Uptime. They have also 4 ratings. The outcome is pretty much the same. Rated 1 and 2 are not for very critical environments where we have only the capacity available or maybe some extra redundant capabilities in terms of equipment. But we still have a lot of single point of failures and therefore a high level of risk. It doesn't mean it's a bad data center, but it obviously means that you have a higher elevated risk of interruption of your business. Therefore, most business critical data centers obviously rely on rated 3 and rated 4. Rated 3 is what is called a concurrent maintainable data center. And this basically means that your data center can undergo any form of planned maintenance without any impact to the critical IT load. So whether you want to replace batteries, or you want to replace a chiller, or you want to replace a pipe or a cable, as long as you plan it well in advance, then it would not or should not have at least an impact on the critical load. Rated 4 allows the same thing, so it's also a concurrent maintainable data center, but on top of that, it also allows for one fault anywhere in the installation, and that would not have an impact on the critical load. So you could have, for example, a whole electrical system path failing, and still your IT will be protected. You could have a chiller failing or whatever, and still you could run your IT critical load continuously. So this obviously is known for very mission critical businesses. Most data centers go for rated 3, or maybe doing some extra on top of rated 3, but are not able to go all the way to rated 4, because that's obviously quite an expensive type of data center setup. But remember, you can have the best data center in the world from a physical infrastructure point of view, but you still need to have proper processes in place and competent staff, of course, managing those processes. Otherwise, you could be still vulnerable to downtime. For TIA certification, it applies to a variety of elements of the data center. It could be the building itself and the design and the constructed facility. It could be applicable to modular data centers, the typical container style, etc. It could be a modular DC, which is typically within the compute room, but also products like generators, chiller systems, etc. So each of them can be certified. And typically you will hear names like DCDV. So if you hear the term, I have a DCDV certificate, that is a design certificate. DCCC would be when the auditor has visited the physical data center and did obviously the assessment there. And then we have products like TIA-942 ready, which is for the container style and prefabricated structures. And then we have the modular and the product certification, all based on requirements for TIA. So this is hopefully giving you a bit of an idea, what some of the key differences are. There are, of course, also technical differences if you really look at the details of electrical and mechanical design, but at least at a high level, hopefully you understand where some of the main differences are. So we thought it would also be useful to go through some of what we call the myth busting, because there is quite a bit of confusion and quite a stories going around in the market that are not always correct. So one of them that is the statement that TIA-942 is an American standard and therefore you cannot apply it in other countries. Well, that is not true. This typically comes from those people that maybe know TA from the early days, the 2005 when it was first released, when it was still very American-centric. For example, we were stating what kind of voltage system you should use, etc. All that is gone. So the 942C is truly a global applicable standard. Yeah, so in that sense, although it's written in the US, you can apply it to any data center anywhere in the world. And if you go to the EPI-certification website, you can actually see that the standard has been applied to many, many data centers around the world. Another confusion that we hear is that people say, hey, data centers cannot be certified against the requirements for TA. Well, that is not true. Obviously, it can be, and as explained, the TA standard is an official standard, and they have an appropriate scheme, an accredited scheme that lays down the law on how audits need to be performed and who actually can perform them. So, yes, of course, data centers can be certified. Oh, I pressed the button twice. The other thing is that people say sometimes, well, TA certification is just a paper checklist. Right? That is not true at all. Of course, the key criteria are all in the standard, but it's not a paper exercise. Yeah, TA audits are outcome-based. Yeah, and the outcome is obviously defined as concurrent, maintainable, or a full data center, a full tolerant data center. So what we do during the actual audit, we will go down to the physical site, and one of the key elements that will be assessed is the test and commissioning documents of the site when obviously it was first done. Yeah. Now that is obviously basically reviewed in great detail to make sure that all the elements are properly covered. If there were any anomalies during the test and commissioning discovered, then those will be reviewed, how they have been followed up, how they've been retested, etc. Now that is quite good. Obviously, now some people say, yeah, but you don't do actually load testing anymore, etc. Well, the question is, of course, why would you do that if it has been done already? Because it adds greatly to cost and delays. And of course, if you have already a data center where you have mission critical load running, you really are not inclined to add extra load banks in a data center or flipping off the electrical supply. Because most of the time you would not even be able to do that anyway because of contractual obligations with customers that you might have running in the data center. So apart from the high level of risk, there is typically also a compliance element to it which prevents you to do so. The other statement that we hear quite frequently that others throw in the market, they say, well, TA doesn't certify data centers. Well, luckily they don't, because that would be a violation. Because as I explained, there are different elements in the whole chain for standard development all the way down to conformity assessment checks, and each of those are taken care of by different organizations. So luckily, TA themselves are not doing, because that will be a conflict of interest, and that's why certification bodies like EPI have been appointed, and again, we are overseen by accreditation organizations. Another confusion that we hear often in the market, that people say, TA-942 certification is much more difficult than getting an uptime certification. I guess there is a little bit of truth to both of it. It's not completely true, it's not completely false, I would say. Maybe you could argue the case that it is more difficult because, of course, there are more elements under the scope of the audit. Yeah, so we're not just looking at power and cooling, but we're looking at many other aspects that could pose a risk to your data center. So for that aspect, you could argue, yes, it covers more, therefore it might be more difficult. However, from a risk management perspective, I really would like to have everything checked, because I don't want to end up in, for example, having a risk in my network, if that never was checked. If you look at purely the scope for scope, as you understood now, the uptime tier topology is looking critically at the electrical mechanical system. If you compare that from TIA, so the electrical mechanical requirements from uptime versus TIA, then it is actually not more difficult at all. In fact, I believe there are some elements in the uptime guidelines that could be quite a challenge for some organizations. Another thing that we always hear, and that is a bit of fear mongering, I guess, in the industry, is that they say, TA is many criteria, right? And if you just have one item that you can't comply, then you end up in trouble. You never get certified. We have heard stories that some customers said, well, somebody told us that if we don't have a car park separated from the building, then we will fail and we can never get a certificate. That is not true. That is obviously stories that are put in the market by people that do not understand how proper auditing works. In auditing, we always have what we call minor and major non-conformities. Major non-conformities obviously would pose a risk for certification. For example, a data center that's targeted at rated 3, and we can prove that it's not concurrent maintainable. That's obviously a major non-conformity because that is the outcome that is expected for a rated 3 data center. But if the light is not 500 lux, but it's 400 lux, well, that has no impact directly on the concurrent maintainability criteria. And that is what we then would say is a minor non-conformity, has no impact on the expected outcome, and therefore there is no risk for the data center, and as such, you can still be certified. So be very careful. People that come up and say, if you miss out one item, you're going to be in trouble. That is pertinent, not true. The other thing that we hear sometimes that people say, we cannot use the word tier if we have a TIA-942 based data center. Now, just for the clarification, Uptime does not own the word tier. Let me be very clear. Although it's often claimed, it is not true. Okay, you have tier 1 telcos, you have tier 1, in say airline loyalty cards, etc. So tier is not a protected word, right? So although it's not probably appropriate, right? Because that in TIA-942 we're talking about rated and rating, but it's very common in data center land that people call themselves tier 3, tier 4, etc. Should you use it with the 942 data center? Probably not. Not really, the best thing to do. But you're not going to be sued. Nobody can say I own the word tier, etc. Now, obviously, what you cannot do is claim to be, for example, an Uptime Tier 3 data center when you have not been properly assessed by the Uptime Institute to see whether you've met all their criteria in their guideline. So don't make false statements about being certified or compliant to either TA or Uptime. That is, of course, not appropriate to do. Another thing what we hear in the market say, well, you really have to make a choice. It's going to be an Uptime certification or it's going to be a TA certification. Again, that's a false statement. There are quite a few data centers that have actually obtained both certifications. Okay, again, the outcome is the same: fault tolerant, concurrent maintainable, etc. Of course, there are some technical differences in terms of how, for example, Uptime or TA expect certain systems to be. But the proof is in the pudding. There are data centers that have achieved both certifications. So it's not that you have to really choose one or the other. You can choose Uptime, you can choose TIA, or you can choose both, depending on your business requirements and what you believe is best for your data center. So that is hopefully giving you some clarity on some of the big confusions we hear in the market. So what about if you want to go from your current Uptime environment into the TIA-942? Let's say that you would like to do this. Okay. Now, why would you first of all do it? There are a few elements and a few reasons that we've heard from customers why they move from having an Uptime only into an Uptime and TA certification. As I explained, the scope is one big thing. People have come to recognize that you can have an Uptime certificate, but that from the tier topology covers mainly the electrical mechanical systems. All the other areas are not really in scope, but that still have portrays, of course, a risk. It also gives sometimes credibility issues. We've seen data centers that are coming from a telco background, for example, And of course, it looks quite silly that if you are a data center from a telecom infrastructure organization and you only have done, an assessment on electrical and mechanical system, you very quickly would get the question, and why have you not done an assessment on your telecom infrastructure? So that's where we see that people start moving towards the TIA-942. The other issue is that there are quite a few design certificates that floating around in the market, and people are not moving to the constructed facility. Often that has to do with cost, has to do with maybe risks in terms of that you have to do live testing, etc. And again, I can of course have a nice design and make a tier 4 easy peasy. But of course, when it comes down to construction and implementation, I might end up in being, a level 3 data center. So this is quite a risk, of course, especially for the end users using the data center. And there is the cost. The uptime certification versus TIA certification. The indication that we have heard in the market that the TIA certification in general tends to be more cost effective. So that could also sometimes be a hindrance in that sense. Okay. So what are the options available? Well, if you have an uptime design certificate, you could also get a TIA-942 design certificate. That's one option for the upgrade. If you have a design certificate currently from Uptime and you would like to go to a constructed facility, you can move that also to 942. So we take the certificate from the design and move it into a constructed facility. And of course, you could also say, I have a constructed facility certificate already from Uptime, and I would like to also have a constructed facility certificate from TA to again look at a broader risk portfolio that your data center might have. Again, it's not a replacement. Yeah, you can have obviously both certificates nicely side by side. So your investment there is protected. So who could do this? Well, obviously you must have a uptime certificate. Yeah, so those data centers that claim to be uptime compliant but have not gone through the certification with Uptime obviously are not eligible. So you need to have a valid certificate issued by the Uptime Institute. That could be a design or it could be a constructed facility certificate. With the design, and I think that's worth noting, the design certificates that were issued before January 2014, they were having kind of a lifelong validity. But that has been changed. So now Uptime gives that the 2-year validity that I explained earlier. The Uptime constructed facility doesn't have any expiry date, but we will recognize as long as it has been, issued by them. So it could be a certificate that was issued 15 years ago. It could have been, done last week, so to speak. Both will serve as a valid certification for the upgrade program. So the benefits, depends on from which angle you are looking. If you're an operator owner of a data center, whether that's an enterprise data center or whether that is a commercial data center, a hyperscaler, cloud provider, commercial data center, of course, this will help you to overall be more critical of the various risks that you might have in your infrastructure, because the scope is just far more wider. The reality is that we also see that more and more organizations are asking for TA certification, so that obviously could be one of the extra motivators as well. And as I said, it tends to be more cost effective to do so. End users, what we see is that they have a little bit more confidence because the certificate for TA is maintained. It's a yearly validity check. So if a facility has undergone changes, it will be detected and it will be re-evaluated. So there is no risk of having a cert that was issued, many, many years ago, and the operator owner has made changes and never reported it, and therefore the certificate is not properly reflecting the actual situation anymore, which again is a risk for the end user. We also see there that the board of directors and investors are requiring more and more, evidence that data centers have been properly, built to take out that risk factor, of course, to strengthen the asset value that they place on the data centers. As you know, there's a lot of investment going on, and investors obviously want to ensure that their risk is protected from a financial point of view, and obviously from an operator point of view, from a technical point of view. And overall, of course, following standards is always good from a governance perspective. And if you're a facility manager, well, it's all about risk mitigation, right? You want to make sure that, you can sleep at night and you don't have to worry about something suddenly popping up that you were not aware of. And again, we hear often saying that, we're working with a design and build company that have done it already so many years. Well, as we always say, trust is good, checking is better, right? And we still take out design issues, even from the most experienced companies. There might be still a breaker or a valve in the wrong position, and it was simply overlooked. Don't forget, the designs are getting very complex nowadays. So in that sense, a small mistake can easily be done, and if it's overlooked, that could be quite disastrous in the long term. Now, in terms of the audit process, just to give you a quick rundown on how that typically looks like. Of course, you have always the initial phase where all the paperwork is being done. Then the customer obviously need to prepare for the audit, which is typically the documents that are related for it when it comes to the design review. Obviously, then the design review will be done. And then the on-site facility audit will be conducted, where auditors will come on site and put a good shining light on all the elements of your data center. Reporting will be done. If there's any potential risk identified, you have, of course, the chance to rectify that. And again, we're looking specifically at major non-conformities, which could have an impact on the outcome. And of course, then you get your certificate. That's the proud moment. And as I said, then, of course, it's time to maintain your certificate so that you can be assured, as well as your customers can be assured, that everything is in conformance with what the standard requires you to do. And with that, I have ended my presentation. So nicely done, 45 minutes. So we have some time for question and answers, Dean.
Yeah, thanks for that, Edward. And quite a lot of questions have actually come in. So some really good ones and fun ones too. All right, jumping in. Thanks to everyone who sent questions through. As I said earlier, if we don't get through all of them, we will respond either directly after the webinar is completed. And again, if there's any questions you've got, you can always reach out to us. So the first question we got in was from someone called Allah Ishkubi. I hope I've pronounced that correctly. The question was, the slide shows that UTI is a guideline, not a standard. My question is this from whose perspective? Who says that UTI is a guideline and not a standard? Considering that there is another perspective that says that UTI is a standard, and that's what UTI say themselves.
Sure. No, good question. As explained, right? When we talk, and we're talking from an ISO standards development type of perspective, right? A standard has oversight. A standard is fully transparent. So there's always a document with a proper number, laying down all the criteria, etc. So again, of course, everybody uses the word standard, right? It's quite loosely used. But if you would go to ISO and you say, give a definition of a standard, then they would basically give the definition that I've been given, that it has to be an SDO that has been accredited and that has proper oversight from a complete impartial organization. So that's where the statement comes from.
We got a fantastic question from Elvis. He said there's a trend in Europe that, given the current inadequate behavior of the US, it casts doubt on the application of American standards, especially uptime. Europe is increasingly looking towards EN 5600. What are your thoughts on this?
Right. Yes and no. Obviously, the whole trade issues and tension between the US and other continents. I think that in itself has no real impact on standards. Of course, people might be emotional about it, but the guidelines that Uptime have written and the TA standard that has been written, they're coming from a technical, unbiased political point of view. So I don't think that has any impact. EN 5600, yes, a nice document. Pretty much 80%, 90% comes out of TA. That was at the heart of the whole thinking around it. However, I don't see a lot of uptake other than in Germany. The biggest uptake that you will find probably is under the ISO 22237, which is, again, it's almost like a copy from the EN 5600. So I personally think that the main players, obviously TIA-942, Uptime, and ISO 22237, those will be the key ones for the future. I think EN 5600 being really a European perspective, I think that slowly will start fading off, I would say.
I think to expand on that just a little further too, the committee process that TIA goes through means that it's a global standard and there's a global perspective on the design and construction of the data center. It's not necessarily an American perspective, whereas with Uptime being an American business, it is more of an American perspective, but TIA is global because the committee members are global. So it's
Completely global.
people, yeah, from the industry, guys
Yeah,
like you
yeah,
are on the call
yeah,
that are
yeah.
participating in that
And
standard.
that's quite also with the EN. The EN is actually driven by people in Europe. To give you an idea, I'm living in Singapore. You know, I could not be on the EN 5600 committee because I'm living in Singapore, although I'm a European. So just give you an idea how close it is sometimes.
Yeah, we had a question from William Heng that does need to be addressed. He says that TIA-942 is not a certifiable standard and it's a misleading myth in the industry. Right. The next one is from Pranshu Yogi. Are there certain markets around the world that prefer uptime over TIA or vice versa?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, obviously, you know, certain markets have a higher rate of maybe uptime or TA, and that is typically because of, say, marketing efforts, you know, local presence, etc. So if you look at certain continents, the number of say TA certifications is just like, for example, let's say in the Philippines, it's dominated by 942. If you would go to, say, the Saudi market, yeah, Uptime, you know, has a lot of certifications in that particular market. So sometimes it's a bit 50-50, sometimes it's dominated by one or the other player, but we see a strong growth now on TIA actually in many markets. Yeah.
Another good question from Stephanie said, is there a will to align the EN 5600 standards with the TIA eventually and consolidate them to some degree?
Yeah, that's what everybody's hoping for, right? Everybody hope that, you know, instead of having more standards of the same, there will be only one. Unfortunately, that has to do with politics. Yeah, everybody always wants, every organization wants to be leading. So in that sense, even within, you know, the EN and the ISO, there is some level of, you know, competitiveness, I would say, between the organizations. But again, I think the market itself will ultimately determine, yeah, what they believe is the most applicable standard. And again, from my personal perspective, I don't think EN is going to be dominating from a global perspective. I think that will slowly fade away, and I think that the 22237 will take over what the EN 5600 is covering now in terms of market.
Kerry Wang asked, if their data center already has Uptime Tier 3 certification, does it make it easier to get the TIA certification?
Yeah. Obviously, that means that the electrical mechanical systems have been already assessed. We do know, of course, where the differences are between, say, the viewpoint of uptime in terms of electrical mechanical versus TIA. But there are, as I said, a lot of similarities as well in terms of philosophy. So yes, it will make you know, our assessment time, you know, shorter, so to speak, and obviously that has a cost benefit to the customer.
We got a question from Hakim. He once said, we are not sure whether we comply with TIA, so my boss doesn't want to spend the money on starting an audit and then failing it. Are there other ways to find out how we can comply without immediately going through the audit process?
Yeah, it's you know, we see that often actually, you know, where customers say, you know, the design might not have been completely with, you know, the TA in mind in the old days. So we don't want to spend maybe the money, or we don't want to have the risk that we start an audit process and then we fail. So what we normally do for those situations, we offer what we call a quick scan, yeah, where we basically looking at what the typical issues are in data centers. Yeah, that impact, for example, concurrent maintainability, etc., which might be very hard to fix, or might require quite a bit of an investment and even time. So then, of course, the data center operator owner can say, okay, well, we're willing to fix it, and we'll start, you know, getting budget in place for maybe next year. And then when that is all done, then we go into the official audit cycle. So that is a service that, you know, is not so impactful on the organization, doesn't have the visibility that sometimes audits has, right? Because that always sounds very scary. So yeah, we have a quick gap analysis, the quick scan that can accommodate that.
Stuff. Right. The next one was, since TIA covers a lot more in the scope, including architecture, many people have thought that the cost will be higher to comply with TIA compared to Uptime. What are your thoughts on this?
Not really, because obviously we are living in a competitive market. In terms of Uptime, obviously their pricing model is based on their internal pricing model, and there is no competition. As I said, right, only Uptime has the privilege to do uptime assessments, and therefore they can set the price at whatever they believe is the right price for the services they offer. In our case, we have to deal with competition. And obviously, when there's competition, that typically leads to more competitive pricing in the market, and that ultimately benefits the data center operator owners.
From Mohammed, he said Uptime told him that TI is just a telecom standard. It's not a data center standard. Is this true?
Yeah, that's the typical thing, and that's normally caused by the title of the standard. When it was originally developed, it was called the Telecoms Infrastructure Standard for data centers. But if you look at the scope, yeah, it is obviously all the supporting elements as well. So it's not just looking at the network itself, but it takes all the other elements that are indicated into the scope as well. So although the title is Telecoms Infrastructure Standard for data centers, yeah, it does include all the supporting elements, that I've mentioned. So yes, it's a true, fully encompassing data center standard.
We got a good question from Raphael. He said, you mentioned that TI can be applied anywhere, but there are some items that refer to NFPA or ANSI. Do you mean that the data center has to be built under either the NFPA or ANSI on those items?
No, it doesn't have to be. So if you have a local code that is applicable, then that obviously will overrule. But as you would see, and especially, for example, NFPA, which is very much related to fire safety, most of the local standards are kind of like taking their information from the NFPA. But the local code always overrule international code. So if you have a local code for fire safety, that will apply then to the data center. And as long as that gives you the safe environment, then there is no impact on TA, no issue.
We're getting quite a few questions about access to the webinar after the presentation. We'll be sharing the presentation with everyone and making or providing access to the video offline too. So everyone that's still on, don't worry, it'll be made available to you. Another question is, how is TI certification going to keep up with liquid cooling?
Actually, in the latest version, so the 942-C, which was released last year, there is a specific section on liquid cooling. In this case, addressing immersion cooling, which at that time was the hot topic. And obviously, as new technologies come in, like cold plating, etc., that will be highlighted in the technical committee. There is every second week there is a call where new items could be addressed, and that would then be taken either in as an addendum, or it will be part of the new revision.
Another question from Elvis. He wants to know, can you elaborate more on the quick scan service? What is being evaluated? What is the outcome for it? And report to customer. Yeah.
Okay, so the quick scan looks at the main key items that could lead to non-conformity. So we zoom in on the electrical, mechanical systems to make sure that they are either fault tolerant or concurrent maintainable, depending on your rating. But we would not really look at, for example, say your camera infrastructure. That is all easy to fix. Fire safety, we look at the high level, but we're not going into the extreme detail of all your sensor location, because those things again can be moved. So we would really looking at call it the big ticket items. Is the incoming power as what TIA wants? Is your generator infrastructure, your UPSs, your power distribution, your cooling and your telecom infrastructure meeting the key requirements? So that could have an impact on concurrent maintainability. Anything that does not really have an impact potentially on concurrent maintainability, those are the ones that we say we don't really have to look at it, because that's something that can always be reviewed later during a real audit. The outcome is obviously a report. No?
We got a question from Ikadize. Hope I pronounced that correctly too. He said TIA-942 is more like a standard for conformity. Does this mean that every data center must conform to the standard before a certificate can be issued?
Well, as I said, right, in terms of conformity, yes, it has to conform to the main items that have an impact on the outcome. So we would review the data center based on major and minor non-conformities. As long as the majors are, solved, and for the minor, there is some level of an action plan available, then that's, basically then we can issue a certificate. No.
Excellent. We got another question about the ISO 22237, saying it's another standard. How is it different from the TIA-942?
Not a lot, to be honest. It addresses all the same areas in terms of power, cooling, etc. The philosophy is slightly different in that, for example, for a security point of view, in TA, right, they have it built into the framework. So a rated 4 data center by nature is more secure. Whereas in, for example, the ISO 22237, the security is unbundled from availability. So you could have, for example, a availability rating of level 4, and you could have a security rating, a protective rating of level 2. So those two are separate. That's one of the key differences. And then again, there are some minor technical differences here and there, but the overall outcome again is the same.
Manny Candon asked, what does the TIA-942C standard provide with regards to flexibility over MEP compared to 942B?
Okay, now yeah, there are some changes. Some fundamental changes that were done is on for example the diesel infrastructure and the option that you can also use gas-based turbines rather than just diesel. And again, that has to do with some people going more to the green scenarios. So now we don't talk about generators anymore. We talk about backup power systems. So that could be, for all intended purpose, it could be a BESS. It could be, a nuclear power plant, a miniature reactor. So it has given more wider definitions rather than being more specific about, it must be a diesel generator like it was in the previous versions.
We've had a lot of the similar question coming through, asking just for a quick, concise summary of what the differences are between Uptime and TIA.
I think the key thing is scope. Right, Uptime Tier topology focus on power cooling. TIA takes power and cooling plus all the other elements. I think that is a key difference from a scope point of view. Of course, one is a true certified accredited standard with an accreditation scheme for auditing, and it's more open. Whereas Uptime is proprietary in terms of it's all owned and operated and decided by Uptime. I think those are some of the key elements. Of course, you can go into technical details, how Uptime defines a data center. Of course, you can go into costing, which is a whole different aspects influenced by various elements as well. But no.
Mohammed says, if TIA is the official standard for data centers, does it mean that there are two standards, Uptime and TIA?
Uptime, in our definition, is not an official, accredited standard. That's why we say it's a guideline. But people consider it as a standard, right? They say Uptime standard, TA standard. Some again talk about the ISO 22237. So those, I would say, are the three leading ones that you would see in data center land, where operators will choose from. And again, sometimes they don't make a choice; they just apply all of them.
We had a question saying Uptime assumes the data center must not depend on any incoming utility power sources. If Uptime Tier 3 certified DC doesn't have two incoming utility power sources, is EPI able to certify the data center as rated 3 under the TIA-942?
Yeah. There's actually a very key difference. Uptime assumes that the element or the main energy source is indeed the generator infrastructure, where TA says it's your incoming utility power. The good thing is, of course, that if you have, say, a data center infrastructure based on uptime, that means you have typically prime or continuous rated generators. In Tier A, there is a clause that they call the self-generation clause. So even if you would have an uptime certified site and you have only one utility entry, you can still be TIA certified, because it means that your other leg, so to speak, is under a self-continuous operated environment, and that will satisfy the TIA requirement. So utility is not a problem in that aspect.
Kadega asked, there's many data centers in Africa, and can EPI assist facilities in Africa with certification?
Yeah, we've done multiple certifications out there. So we're a global organization. So basically, any part of the world we can do assessments.
Gosh, got so many here. Does the TIA-942 cover all telecommunication services?
Yes, it's basically takes it all the way from the POP location all the way down to the back of the rack. So it covers all the way from incoming, so to speak, and where the incoming comes from, all the way, in how you route it through the building, how many carriers you have, where they are properly separated and segregated, and how they end up ultimately in the back of the rack.
We've got some very good questions here. One from Senil. He wanted to know how come Uptime Sustainable Operational Standard was not included in this presentation to perform an apple-for-apple comparison.
Because the sustainability is, not part of that tier topology. So it's a whole separate ball game. The operation sustainability is a completely different certification, adds additional cost and complexity.
Hatem has asked, for the same project roughly, how long does it take to be certified with Uptime versus TIA-942?
Obviously, I can't speak completely for Uptime, right? Because obviously they have their own time schedules, etc. For TIA, again, there are many elements. Assuming that your building is ready, for example, and all the documents are, in the good place. When we come on site, it typically takes, say 2, 3, 5 days. That is the typical runtime. Sometimes a bit longer, sometimes a bit shorter. The report generation is typically about, around 2 to 6 weeks. Now, obviously, if you have no major non-conformity, then literally within 2 months, you could be all, certified from the day that, the PO comes in all the way till the cert gets issued. If there are issues, let's say that you're missing a generator, well, obviously then it could take more time to get certified because, it might require capital raise, get the investment done. Generators nowadays, it could take, 6 months, even up to 1.5 years before the generator comes in. So then, of course, the whole certification cycle could be longer. But that is purely because you're missing something on the infrastructure that is not compliant. But if everything is okay, within 2 months, you can be start to finish, can be certified.
We've got a question here from Ahmed who wants to know if the major audits are only the ones affecting concurrent maintainability, this implies that the organization certified with Uptime will be certified with TIA with no more additions.
Not really, because obviously the scope is very different, right? So it doesn't mean that if you are, let's put it this way, if you are an Uptime certified site for a constructed facility, it doesn't automatically mean you can achieve, TA because other elements have not been evaluated by them. So that could obviously be different. If you are a TIA certified site, it does not automatically mean that you can achieve uptime because again, they have some philosophical differences like the generator incoming, etc., which could, be a mismatch between their thing. So if you want, as a data center designer and builder, want to make sure that you have the option later on to be certified for either one or both, then obviously you need to take those technical considerations from both perspectives straight into your design.
Syed wanted to know, is the TIA-942 valid for cable landing stations?
Yeah, it is actually. It can be applied. In fact, we have certified quite a few landing stations for TA.
Rafi Udine had an interesting one. He said the uptime topology is described based on electrical and mechanical systems. How do TI standards define critical and non-critical systems such as fire and security? And do TI also have final scripts to do the on-site verifications?
Well, in terms of scripts, obviously, every certification body, has their own methodology in how they do assessment. So, for example, in our case, we have an audit tool where we basically run through every single criteria that applies to every room. So if we go to the UPS room, we have a whole set of criteria that we need to validate. If we go to the genset area, we have a whole set of, and so we have a very strict methodology of how we execute audits. And again, that is because we are accredited under ISO 17021, so we must have a proper, consistent process in place. Of course, I know that in this type of environment, always there is what we call the gray market. Some of those guys with a PC under the bed living with the mother, and they come with a document and say, well, I can do an audit as well. Well, that's obviously not a certified body, and those should not be trusted.
Timothy Kabui wanted to know, is it possible to get the 160-page TI standard document, and where can you get it from?
You can get it. You can download it from the website from Accuris. If you do a search in Google, say, TI-942-C PDF document, you'll most likely bump into the thing. Although it is a paid document. It's not a free document that is floating around. So it is a paid for copy.
We are 10 minutes over. I think we'll go for another 5 minutes and then we'll wrap it up. Sure. Again, to everyone, look, if we haven't got to your questions, don't worry, we will come back to you offline too. So one of the other questions we got you is, what are the estimated costs for the DCDV and the construction conformity?
Yeah, that varies a lot. Obviously, pop us an email, then we can help you. But normally we look at various aspects in terms of, say, how big is your site? If you have multiple compute rooms, are they copy-paste from each other? Or are they vastly different? What type of targets you're looking for? Because a rated 2 data center can be easier assessed because it doesn't have so many strict requirements as, for example, a rated 4. So if they want to have a cost estimate, and again, free of charge, of course, then just drop us an email at sales@epi-ap.com. And then, we can link you up with one of the business development managers that can ask you the right questions for us to come up with some guesstimate on the pricing.
Yeah, Salman wanted to know if you can confirm the statement that Uptime doesn't cover architectural, networking, security, or cabling.
Not in the tier topology document. The tier topology document primarily addresses electrical and mechanical. Yeah, if you want to look at the architectural stuff, etc., there's something that they call TCOS, the operational sustainability part, that is covering some of those aspects. But again, that's a different certification track.
Muhammad asked, is facility size an issue, or can smaller sites follow the TIA-942 standard too?
Actually, it can. It's funny enough. We have one site that is literally it's 5 racks, but it's from a trading company, so they do all this stock trading. It's only 5 racks, and they are rated 4 because if those racks go down, they will be in immense trouble. So yes, it applies to very small environments all the way up to the hyperscale type.
Excellent. Look, I think with that, it's probably time to wrap things up. Look, we have had a lot of technical questions that have come through around specifications and the TIA standard itself. We'll be happy to address those offline for those of you who've asked them. I've intentionally avoided some of those questions because they might be a bit technical for some of the people who were part of the audience today. But again, thank you to everyone who's joined today. We had a fantastic turnout both here and on the YouTube channel. And we appreciate you taking the time to join us today. So thanks to Paige for setting up and Edward for the presentation too. It's much appreciated.
Again, just reach out to us if you have any other questions, and we're more than happy to help you guys all out. So thank you very much for the attention and take care.
Excellent. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.